very natural quality to this, the way that the buildings nest in the forest. And then that natural quality is sort of spiritual. I like that about the temples in Japan is there's um, this feeling that they just grew up out of nature. Everything is in harmony with the natural surroundings. Some stray leaves are catching the autumn light. All right, let's lay out our subject. This is a subject, it's a panorama. So we're looking over a big space from a high point. So our horizon line is actually very high in the painting. Some distant mountains that surround the city of Nara. In fact, we're standing on a mountain as well. We have the temple of Todaiji. Just want to get the proper angle to this temple. It's basically, well, you can tell the shape is based on a triangle, but there's some interesting subtleties to that shape. The sort of bending roof is one of them. So I want to make sure I want to capture that. And then below is a lot of foliage. And we have a small compound of buildings below as well. Which form the temple grounds. Some small pitched roofs, trees, lots of trees. And this is autumn, so that there's some brightly colored trees as well. This is the rooftop that's closest, so as they go back, these rooftops are receding. And a little bit of a temple coming in from the side as well. We'll repeat this drawing when we do our larger piece. So this sort of practice is always good. There's a little bit of a bowing to this roof. Actually, to most of them, they have those sorts of lines. Let's get this a little better. These are smaller shapes, but important shapes because they capture the light of the light coming from this direction. Something about like that. And I'm just accounting for the major shapes. It's just a little longer. The major shapes that carry us back into the painting. Todaiji, we're looking down the length of it. So the rooftop has an interesting feature of these rising, almost like horns at the end. This is a minor shape, but helps to break up all these darks down here. Dormer coming out. So these are the basic shapes that we have to work with. And I want to think about this now in terms of lights and darks and edges. How am I going to use edges? So behind everything is very light. Our subject is very light. And as it comes forward, we have a strong contrast. This area, which is against the sun, then there's a little luminosity coming into the foreground. So I can think of that in graded washes. Let's use our graded wash. We've certainly become familiar with that. So let's paint our first graded wash, which is, well, we start light at the top. As it's coming forward, it's getting a little bit darker to the right-hand side to depict that movement across the sky. We can carry that into the foliage because I want to use some soft edges here and build in a second graded wash into the foreground. Putting all of this into sort of a darkness, and then we're going to let it dry and return to that second part. So for this first wash, I'm using a medium size mop brush, which carries a lot of liquid to the paper. You can see my shapes, they're pretty darkly drawn. Let's start with just the palest. I'm using a single color, by the way, neutral tint. Let's start with the palest version of that, almost nothing through here. Bring it right down to right over all of this. I do want to leave some gaps for the city area, so I'm just leaving a few spotty whites here. I'm painting right over all of this. While this is wet, however, I want to return with a little stronger pigment and bring that into the right-hand side, just to get this feeling of light moving across the sky in this fashion. So the color is going to drift down, give me a little bit of a feeling of left to right. We continue downward. You notice that I stopped the line here on that white edge so that I could keep some whites through there. just to wet this area. And then I'm going to switch to a smaller brush, which is this Sablette brush. Has a nice point, but primarily I'm doing that because it carries a lot less water. And I'm building up a strong midtone here. Strong midtone. Look at the paint thickness. Pretty thick. I want to keep this wet while I'm working, this lower section. So I just occasionally hit it with the spray bottle to keep it a little damp. And then I'm going to work into the foliage here. You want to keep a soft edge on that. You can tell it's very wet below. Oops, excuse me. I want that upper edge to be soft. As though the light can, so the light can kind of stream off of it. More of this paint. And I don't mind getting quite dark through here. Number one, I'm working into a wet area. I'm going to paint right over the rooftops, as you can tell. All the way down to the bottom. I'll leave a little white for this one. And once more, I want to adjust this while it's still dark, while it's still wet. Put in some more darks while it's wet so I can get that nice soft quality to everything. And I'm going to use, start to switch to a smaller brush and pull out a few forms. You've noticed I'm starting to build in the shape of a pine tree, right? And I've got this dark here, pretty thick, not straight from the tube, but pretty thick. And you just we can paint a few rising trees against all of this. We can also start to bring out, I'm going to paint around some of my rooftops with this stronger dark, just to suggest them. I'm not making a final of this yet, but just to suggest them while it's wet. This is a bit of a difficult way of working because we're using, the paint spreads out as we apply it. And that's the desired effect. That's what I want to happen. And you start to see little shapes of trees in this. So I'm adding some darks around those trees. Build up the feeling of that forest and some suggestions of rooftops below. Basically two tones, that light tone above, which is just starting to dry, and the mid-tone below, which is also starting to dry. Got some marks there. That tells me that yes, it is starting to dry a little bit. So let's let's let this lower section dry. And we can work, now we can work in the rooftop, because this area is pretty well dry. If not, we can hit it with the paper towel just to make sure. With a small sablet brush, this one, because I need a fine tip. This area should be dry to the touch. Come back in, and I'm going to use about the same consistency that I was using below. The big difference is I'm not working into a wet area, I'm working into a dry area, so it's going to look a little darker. Here's where I want to get a nice hard edge. And come right down to the trees. And kind of wet it or blend it into these trees, so that we have our Todaiji the rooftop of Todaiji, kind of strong against the light sky, melting into the forest below. While this is wet, let's add some of the architectural elements. We can do this while it's wet or while it's dry. Basically, this difference in the tile, the way the tile, a little bit of an accent there. Let's let this dry before we move into it. I'm going to take a hairdryer to this. All right, so I've dried the whole surface off, and you can tell we have a nice mid-tone against this light tone here. We're going to return to paint the background mountains, do a little work in the background, then we're going to return to this foreground and bring out our some of the forms in the foreground. Using again the sablette, we're going to create a graded wash, just adding more water to the paint that I already have. I'm going to use I'm going to use my mop brush to get started. And paint the shape of the mountain. Right down to here, right over Todaiji. And then I'm going to also affect the mountain by adding a little more dark back here to this edge. Start to build in some lines, or basically what we see are distant trees and buildings back here. Just want to make it feel a little more like that. A little darker back here. And also a little lighter. I'm just taking a little water and adding it to this. Just want it to be slightly lighter back here. We can also use a spray bottle for that. Graded wash, all to kind of explain this light coming down. And then we start to work in the foreground to create the feeling of the village, the compound of buildings. We still see the drawing here. I'll start in some places it's a little obvious. Right here is kind of one of the darker areas. That's a good reason to start here. Defining this rooftop, defining the rooftop behind. And there's a little rooftop here. Just to get us started. Defining those rooftops with a few lines. And we can start to build in our, working with dry brush now, some of the treetops. Same time we create these roof lines. And bring some depth to the foreground. And the tree shapes kind of evolve out of this. You can do as much or as little with the shapes of the trees as you want. I am thinking about some of the angled light here and how that moves across the treetops. Working with the small brush helps me not just for control, but when we still have a wet area, we're kind of working in a wet area here, we have a little more control with the placement of strokes and the way that it diffuses into the water. So we're starting to get that sort of nested quality into this area, this lower area. We have a number of rooftops. We're also getting a feeling of treetops, sort of vaguely suggested. And let's use some stronger color, this neutral tint. Pull out a few of these key architectural elements. One in the foreground. Do like this double pitched roof back here. Surround that with some darks. Very natural quality to this, the way that the buildings nest in the forest. And then that natural quality is sort of spiritual. I like that about the temples in Japan, is there's this feeling that they just grew up out of nature. Everything is in harmony with the natural surroundings. So I'm pretty much following the photograph, improvising a little bit. But in the study, I want to get a feeling of the placement of things, the tonal relationships, the feeling of atmosphere. So this got washed out a little bit. We can restate it. Get a definition point up there. But this is about as much as I want to do for the tonal piece. A few more feelings of the pine tree. And just a couple highlights, I think. A couple adjustments. For example, this white is a little too much. Just knock that down. Put that in the shadow. So it feels like everything is in shadow, right? Everything is in shadow. I want to use a couple whites to pick up some of the highlights on the rooftops. So I'm taking just a little white paint, mixing it with that gray area. For example, through here. These little pieces are kind of catching the light. Anyway, at this stage, we're experimenting. Those are actually made of gold. Okay. Yeah, and maybe a few lines for the tile work in the foreground. or even in the background of Todaiji. Put a little bit of, I want to lift a little bit here. Come back to this. Restate some of this a little bit. It is a kind of a misty country. There's a lot of softness in the air, so we don't want to be too definitive. Let's put a few lines just to see how they look. What these would be the tiles. And then the tree kind of comes in front of that. I hope doing this painting doesn't tire us out too much. But it does resolve a lot of things for me. One last experiment is to return to the sky, which has dried very pale. Just going to do a little bit first with water. And then introduce a little bit of tone up here, a little more of that tone across the sky. Concentrate the energy into the left side a little more. Something like that. Okay. Good enough to begin a painting. Okay, everyone. We've got to start with the tonal study, deciding on our combination of lights and darks, putting everything into shadow below, really focusing on the peak of our temple, creating an atmosphere behind with graded washes, using the white of the paper here and there for accents. Let's build up our watercolor in a similar manner. All right, as you can see, I've laid out my paper, same fashion, a little larger size. Have my tonal study up here, which I'm going to refer to. I'm pleased basically with the tonal arrangement. I want to see if I can bring that to life with a little more color, maybe a little more drama in the left-hand sky. We'll see. And So now I get about the process of drawing it. Okay, so again, we start with the horizon line, or let's say this descending slope, almost 2/3 of the way up. We have a horizon through here. We have a mountain range. A bit of sky. And Temple of Todaiji is coming off of that. Just like a triangle, it's the basic shape we're doing. In the photograph, the line of the mountain and the top of the temple are touching. I want to avoid that if I can. That's a little bit of a compositional no-no. It just creates an unnecessary tension, and looks more natural if you. It looks much more natural if you can avoid that. Open here. Something like that. And our bounding trees. There we go. So we're almost eye level with the top of this area of the temple here. See, the trees begin here, and then we have the compound below, mostly trees in between. Remember, these lines are a little saggy, for lack of a better word. Everything made out of tile and wood, so it's a very natural setting. And it's really good for contemplation, for a place to kind of relax and think about nature. A couple pitched roofs there. Bigger, little bit of a bigger roof here. And there's a secondary, which is a little odd. I don't know if we really go with that or leave it. Something like that. Yeah. I also like this roof because it breaks up the trees a little bit. Little dormer coming out of a pitched roof. So it's not the roof that we're used to seeing. This is a little bit of an unusual roof, which in one way allows us to draw it a little more easily because it's more of a pure shape. We're not working from our memory or internal idea of this shape. We can see it more purely as a shape. That makes it a little easier. Trees, more trees. village back here. Not village, it's a real city, but it's so far away. Well, I always see things that I want to correct and more to add, but I'm going to go ahead and start this. This is the basic drawing, right? We have our shape of Todaiji, distant mountains. Above the ancient city of Nara. And the next thing is to think about our washes. That mountain is a little too repetitive. Fix it. You know, this rises and then the mountain rises. Maybe we'll make it a little closer to what it is. Let's see if that looks better. You can tell that design is always occupying my mind. I feel like my Todaiji has gotten a little big. Anyway, I'm not going to stress about it. Even though I want it to be perfect, it's not going to be perfect. The abstract design is basically good for me. Okay, we've got our drawing down. Now it's time to think about the color plan. Basically, I'd like to work in two stages. One is to build up some hues of reds and golds and blues in the lower section. Paint the sky to a finish in the first go. Let it dry and then come back with darker passage in the mountains, darks through the midground and down into the buildings themselves, maybe finishing with the top of Todaiji after the background has dried. So basically two stages to evoke the feeling of luminous colors in shadow. That's one of the, in addition to Twilight, that's one of the aspects of this image that I want to pick up on. Well, we have our drawing in place. We've got the basic things that we need, or I should say that I feel I need when I'm doing any sort of painting is not an overabundance of detail, but at least some of the main parts positioned where I think they're going to work. And from that point, I can start to build the washes. The drawing is done with a little bit of a dark line so I can see through. So I'm going to be painting over these areas with some darker washes. One of the things I want to evoke early on is the changing sky. At this time of day in twilight, the sky is changing dramatically and it's changing very quickly. Of course, we're working in the studio and we're working from a stable image, but the sense of transition should still be there. And we do this most easily, most effectively with the graded wash. So you notice that I'm placing the yellow first, this yellow ochre with a big mop brush, and a lot of water to the left side, a little more color to the right side. So already there's a movement, the beginning of a movement from left to right, and it's going to be something that I focus on in this first stage quite a bit in the sky. I would like to finish the sky in the background in this first session before I move on to painting the darks in the second stage. Well, we use this combination quite a bit of yellow ochre and hinting at cerulean blue in the sky. Not a bright blue sky that would typically be seen during the day, but this is more of a warm sky with some angled light coming in. Our position also kind of dictates the light. Our position is rather high in this painting, and so we're able to see over the rooftops, and if we turn our head to the left, we actually are looking into the sun. So we want some of that sensation in this area. At the same time, I want to structure it so that there's a particular bright spot behind the temple, the top of the temple roof that I'm painting in the distance of Todaiji. So all these things are kind of going on in my mind as I'm laying in this wash. A little bit of strategy as I come down now to where the foothills meet the city of Nara. I'm leaving a lot of white. And it won't remain white throughout the painting, but I want there to be an opportunity to show some rooftops or some patterns of rooftops and buildings, trees in that distance, just below the mountains. So I'm calculating doing some work back there and just leaving it empty at the moment. In the future, or when we start to place that distant mountain, is the time that I think I'll develop that area a little more. Well, we're making our pass into the mountainside now. The porch, I'll call it a porch, or the walkway around the temple of Nigatsu-do gives us this great view, and it's a view that's attracted artists for a long time. I found some wood block prints that I'll post on the cluster site showing some of these views from ancient time, and it really hasn't it really hasn't changed so much. One thing that I did notice is there's a big cypress tree that is growing in the front of this temple, and at one point it was much, much bigger, but apparently that tree has died and they replaced it with a smaller one, so that smaller one is starting to get large now. In any case, we have an unobstructed view from an elevated point, and so the perspective is different for us. Where our horizon is very high in the painting. I think I pointed that out in the drawing, and we're looking into a valley, so we see the rooftops. We don't see the sides of the building, just the tops, and focusing on that is enough to really give us this aerial view. There's no streets or lanes in between these buildings, so we pretty much sketch them as we see them, trying to match the angles. There's no two-point perspective that we're following, really. It's simple shapes, which in one way makes it a lot easier. I'm building up what I see as the sort of the warm tone of a lot of the evergreens that are in front of us, and using yellow ochre, a little bit of burnt sienna, some neutral tint to get this started. As I come down, I'm going to be placing some accent colors into the trees to get a little variety. And the tiled roofs are kind of this silver gray color, so I'm going to be using a bit of blue to represent that. In any case, I'm getting this started, trying to reach a color that's doing what I want. I did begin this with a little bit of water on the topmost edge of these trees so that I get a soft sort of filtered transition between the tops of the trees and this darker element below. using the big mop brush to block it in. I'm working around some white shapes of the rooftops. And once I extend this sort of warm, deep greenish, it's not a true green, it's more of a late summer, early fall green, um, down around the rooftops, I'll start to place the tile color, the tile of the rooftops. And I'm thinking of the mid value here. Everything below the top of Todaiji, the distant temple, is of this value. Whether it changes color or not is not a big concern, but getting a strong representation of the mid value, just like we did in our tonal sketch, thinking about everything below the peak of Todaiji as being the same basic value is the goal here. And in realizing the goal, we have to kind of mute some areas. And truly, it's a generic sort of thing. So we aim at the mid-tone, but there's going to be little gaps and little highlights as well as darks that break up that mid-tone. But the overall quality is that of a deep mid-tone. That's what I'm aiming for here. As I get closer to the edges of the rooftops, you see me switching to the smaller brush. The smaller brush giving me the control that I need to bring some of this dark, thick color right to the edge of the rooftops and catch those shapes. Every once in a while, you see me go to that spray bottle. This is just so that I can keep it in that sort of shiny condition. I want the colors to be present, but I want them to have soft edges. So I'm adding it while this color is still wet. And you see me taking some of the cadmium orange red, some of the cadmium yellow, and just blending it into what I have already. That's going to be the sort of approach that I take in this first stage. There'll be a lot of colors colliding and mixing on the paper, separating the rooftops, yes, but even there, as I start to build them up, you'll notice that sometimes I get a little bit of red that leaks onto the rooftop. All that is good for me, good from my point of view, because it creates a little more harmony and connection between the objects. It also makes it feel more like a watercolor. I like that sensation that there's a little loss of control and that things are kind of blending of their own momentum or blending because it's a watercolor. This is our first big rooftop, making its way into the second, and then finally those last skinny ones in the background. And I preserve a few whites, a few edges as I'm doing this. Most of it's going to be this bluer hue, this blue-gray hue. But I'm going to leave a few whites as accents and to kind of refer to that light coming out of the upper left corner so that I get an even stronger feel of the direction. I think if we're new to watercolor, when that sort of breakaway happens, that just we panic and we think we have to correct it right away. But I've found through the course of many paintings that this actually adds something to the painting, as long as I keep a little bit of transition in the rooftops. And here you can see that the overall goal has been to keep things tonally in terms of light and dark very similar, and that will remain at the foundation of this lower area. Is even though the color changes and we grab a few bright edges here and there, the tonality, the general tone, is that of a dark mid-tone. That dark mid-tone is helping us to create that twilight feel where shadows are really taking over the scene and creating this wonderful sort of mysterious and subtle changing colors in the shadowed areas. So in this first go, I was switching the brush quite often, starting with the big brush up above where I wanted to wet the paper quickly, but where I'm adding smaller accents and important edges, I'm switching to the smaller brush, carrying less water, more paint to the page. This helps me to gauge and control uh, the pigment so that it doesn't all just wash to the bottom. Well, the edge, I'm sorry, the sky portion is relatively dry. And what I think I'd like to do is um, think about painting that mountain range that's behind Todaiji. I'm going to leave the the temple itself as it is and think about painting this background of a mountain range, the distant mountain range. Now, the distant mountain range helps me to create that sense of light moving across the scene as well. Mixing up cooler gray, relying primarily on the cerulean blue. And we've got a lot of yellow in the sky already. Some of that will allow it to come through other places, like on the periphery of our painting. We'll add a little bit more blue. Using the mop brush because I'd like to get a nice calligraphic movement to the range of the mountains, especially the upper area. And in the drawing, you saw that I moved the peak of these mountains slightly to the left so that it didn't line up with the peak of the temple. That was one aspect of the photograph that, in terms of position, I thought I should change. So this bluish color is going to be brought right down to the edge of the forest. And again, it's going to isolate that city area, the distant city in Nara. And while it's wet, I want to spray a little bit the top part of the left-hand side, especially that area that's going to be behind uh, the temple, using contrast. That'll allow me to use contrast to make that peak of the temple a little more effective. So what I'll do is I'll add a little color to the left and right side of this mountain range. At the same time, I'll add a little water to the peak itself, and from the peak it's going to lighten up quite a bit so that we have a nice graded quality to the background. And this is important in setting up the movement of light for the whole painting, is this the graded wash in the sky, and now the graded quality to the mountain range. And I keep that the tonal sketch up above on the right hand side so that I'm constantly reminded about the light and dark aspect of the image that I want to realize. I was happy with the tonal sketch, felt it accomplished what I wanted to do. So rather than a photographic reference, this is more useful to me. And I keep that up there to remind me of the sort of darks that I want to bring to the midground. Switching to a smaller brush and just creating a pattern of shapes, not painting any one shape, any one part of the city, but just breaking up that white area so that we get a feeling that there's some shapes back there. Okay. Well, so far I feel we've accomplished this setting the stage. We have a great place to place the peak of the roof of the distant temple. Well, as you can see, we've set some of the bright notes and basically finished the sky. We've set some of the somber grays and rich warm colors below. The color of our tiles has also been set. Now we return to our center of interest, start to depict the temple against this backdrop, and then start to shape this foreground similar to what we did in our tonal study. Happy overall with the mixing of the colors. Again, I'm looking to create something like this where we have a lot of interesting color play in the shadows. So I'm going to try and develop that in this go. Let's see what happens. All right, so our paintings had a chance to dry off and looking pretty good. The midground that we painted with the warm grays, the cooler tiled roof, the bright hues behind the roof is looking all right. We have that foundation set. Now, if I relate it to the sketch above, I know I have to get much darker. And my first approach is going to be to return to the center of interest and using a smaller brush start to create the rich dark of the distant temple. I'm going to be building up the color from some of the leftovers, which if you remember included some of the yellow ochre, burnt sienna, a little bit of neutral tint, ultramarine blue, but the focus here was a mid-tone that was warm in hue. So I'm going to be making the same sort of approach to the top of the temple. I see a lot of warms there. That's how I want to start. Using a smaller brush, and these lines are important, so I keep my hand resting on the paper. It's nice and dry. I can bring them out, in a gradual fashion. I can even adjust them as I come to the edges of this shape, but I'm trying to get to that kind of bended quality that we see in the rooftop at Todaiji. It's a very beautiful building. In fact, more beautiful from a distance. To see these things up close, of course, is magnificent. To see them from a distance is beautiful as well, and the way that the architecture harmonizes with its surroundings, which was a consideration. It just didn't happen, but the builders and creators of these shrines and temples, nature was a very important element and continues to be. And so you feel when you're looking at them that they were harmonized, that they were um, they considered every vantage. If you see it from one angle, it looks interesting. You see it from another angle, it looks interesting for another reason. So there's this sort of um, consideration that was important for the layout and landscaping and the view to the temple. And I believe too that there is some religious significance to many of these elements. I'm not aware of what that would be, but typically um, the the architects considered those elements as well. For me, it's very much an artistic sensibility, the way that this area has been composed, and I'm not alone. As I said, a lot of artists, um, both past and present, sketch from this veranda or this porch looking down on the city of Nara. Well, I've created that midtone, that warm midtone. I put a couple accent colors up into the peak of uh, the temple. We see a little perspective here in that they have at each end of the roof, we're looking at one side of the roof down the length, are opposing kind of curved sculptures. And so that's where I added an accent. They're made of gold, and we'll refer to that as we move along in the painting. But those little accents um, give the distinction that we need, give some recognizability, and also they add a little bit of flair to the top of the roof, which would otherwise be perhaps too simple of a triangle. Well, it's time to start to work below. I sprayed that edge a little bit with my bottle, and I want to preserve that soft edge to the tops of the trees so that we feel light is streaming over, or we feel that it's a bit hazy in the distance. Some sharpness, of course, to the temple at Todaiji, but um, with the trees, I'd like there to be more of a softness. So mixing up the gray that I intend to use, also a warm gray made from burnt sienna, a little bit of yellow ochre, some neutral tint, and on the right side I cool it off a little bit with ultramarine blue. But to start, just hitting that top edge with my spray bottle so that I get some softness to the edge. The goal in this application, again, is to put everything in this mid-tone and reveal a few autumn trees, reveal a few edges to the rooftops, create the feeling of a dense forest moving back towards the temple. That upper edge is wet, however, as I work down below here, you can tell I'm getting some very strong dry edges. So this is a comfortable way to work where I can really control the paint and define things as I bring down that wash. There's a slight graded quality to it, though I'm not working really hard to make it darker towards the bottom. I think that'll happen naturally, and how much of that I let remain remains to be seen as things come into focus. Autumn is playing a role in this painting. When we were there about this time of year, a couple years ago, the peak of autumn, and it's a very popular destination for that reason. The Japanese maple is spectacular. Um, and the gardens are beautiful. So it makes it one of the more popular areas in the world for viewing autumn foliage. Nara is a little quieter. The city of Nara is a little quieter. We did spend some time in Tokyo and Kyoto, and Kyoto was quite busy. Normally has sort of a small but rich sort of feel to it. Lots of temples, lots of historic areas, lots of gardens. Still a little smaller scale, much smaller scale than, say, Tokyo, and an older feeling to it. Nara is even more of that because of its position in history. It's the ancient capital of Japan, and there's been a great amount of preservation of everything that evolved out of that time. There's always some sort of renovation going on, and they um, they try to keep things from the past alive and well, and that includes trees and plants too. One of the things that I noticed in walking around these gardens is if a tree is starting to lean or starting to fall, they put a crutch under it and support it. If it's starting to move to a wall or a piece of a building, they allow that and sometimes even carve out an area for the tree to continue to grow. So there's this sympathy, this sympathetic nature, feeling towards nature that you feel when you walk over the grounds. And they also do at this time of year a night viewing where they put some low lights on the pathways, light up the lanterns, and you're allowed to walk through some of the temple gardens at night and see the changing colors as they appear illuminated from below. In any case, switching now to the small brush, we covered that forest area pretty quickly. You see me dragging some diagonals across those red areas. This, for me, is the angle of shadows coming across some of the brighter foliage. And I'm going to play on that um, through these darker passages up above, through some of the shadows that fall on the rooftop. This angle is important. It's also referring to that upper left area where we have that broken light above the roof of the temple. So I continue to use that as a sort of motivation for the angle of my strokes, letting them or kind of focusing them on this particular angle, especially where I have a little bit of drama in this red color, for example, or in the rooftop. It's another area where I can make use of this. Some places it won't read as dramatically as across the bright red, but even in a subtle area, it's going to refer to that movement of light and exaggerate or concentrate that feeling of light coming across the scene. want to kind of finalize this upper third before moving on to the rooftops, so I can kind of just, forget about that and concentrate then on working with the rooftops, which are rather flat right now. So the spray bottle continues to evolve as a tool for me. You notice that I'm using it quite a bit in this and other paintings. And you get more predictable results the more you use it. So I use a smaller one with I think I found it in a drugstore. I really don't know, actually remember where I picked it up, but you can find an equal to this, a smaller size, sends a smaller amount of spray, very fine mist, and it's great for, provoking the watercolor a little bit to get it to soften. If you look at the treetop, the line of the trees that rise to meet the temple or the city, there's this nice in and out that is going to translate into light coming through the trees, much like we had in last week's painting. Not the dramatic shafts of light, but more like a smoky light coming through. Sometimes I get an inspiration and that wasn't premeditated, wasn't part of the watercolor plan, but I go with it. Most of the time I go with it. Sometimes I regret it, but I think it's an important part of the process for any artist is to keep the doors open. And if your creative side, if your mind suggests to try something, you get a little idea. You have to choose quickly. Do I follow this idea? Do I give it a try? You can usually find a small area in the painting to experiment, and I'm doing just that with the flicking of the red color, which I guess since I've been doing that in more recent paintings, it's starting to become a habit. I kind of like the way it's looking now, so I know this is going to fade. I'll probably add some more towards the end of the painting. Any case, I continue to kind of finish up the foliage that's coming close to the temples, and now I'm starting to give some thoughts to adding the dark shadows and edging to the rooftops. So I don't quite have the knowledge of what these might be. These are sort of venting parts, perhaps. We might think of them as chimneys that reside on the tops of some of these buildings, but they're a very different style of architecture. So I don't quite know how to describe them better than that. In the terms of the painting, look at how it's repeating. They repeat the shape of our distant Todaiji. They give a little bit of height to the buildings. In other words, below those little peaks, it's a little darker. So they rise up and they catch the light. They present an interesting foil to all of the foliage. Later on, we'll get to place some fun shadows across these tiled roofs. We'll get to add the texture of tile. And here's where I should point out also, you notice that in that first wash, there was some bleeding into the tiles of those ochre colors or little reds. Truly, that is not hurting the painting. In fact, it's adding a little bit of age or a little bit of unevenness to an otherwise very structured element, the rooftop. And I like that. And I think it's going to be a welcome part of the painting in the end. Okay, so now we're going to move to the rooftops a little bit, mixing up a cool gray. And you can tell I'm using that smaller brush. So paint consistency at this point is pretty thick. And also in this stage, with it being close as it is, and the shadows having that sort of dramatic quality, all the strokes are sort of measured, deliberate, not spontaneous. And the pace of the painting has slowed down quite a bit, which is absolutely within the working mode. I like to feel freer and um, more spontaneous in the beginning, and as the painting matures and you start to see it come out, I feel compelled to slow down, be more deliberate, be more economical. Well, if you make a mistake, you can still adjust it. So that roof, the angle of that roof was wrong. I make a little correction here. The color combination that I'm using it's a gray, but it's a very cool gray. Um, the grays in the upper part tend to be on the warmer side. As I'm placing grays, shadows, as I'm placing shadows in the form of grays across the rooftops, I'm adjusting it. I'm making them a little cooler. Even smaller brush, I'm going for some of the details on the top of the roof, some of the tile work that makes up the edges of the various planes, suggesting a little more color up there, but not a lot. The mixture of color is again sort of a coolish gray. Not, I don't want to use black up here because that would be a little harsh, but I'm trying to just bring some of that gray that I used below into the peak of the temple, and I'll probably end up blurring some of these lines a little bit so that it fades into the body of the temple as well. That little definition really is acting as a nice exclamation point to the painting. The center of interest has got much clearer, and I think one of the challenges in painting as you get more experience is how to keep it sort of subtle and yet effective, working towards the sort of overall effect that you want. So subtlety becomes more of a challenge. Drama, we can simply make our colors darker and sharper and get more drama, more contrast. Subtlety becomes a challenge as we get more experienced, and that's what I'm kind of balancing here. You can't see it, but I'm often stepping away from the painting and regarding it from a distance to see how things look overall. And my mind's eye is contemplating, softening some of the edges on the periphery or in the foreground to give a little more mystery, a little more subtlety. One of the last things that we'll do is we'll start to refer to those tiled roofs that are sort of semicircular, but they form a nice pattern both in the distant temple and in this, especially in this one that's nearby. And I'm just using a small brush to create the feeling of the texture of the tile. Small brush and a little bit of a darker version of this gray that makes up the body of the tiled rooftops. The city of Nara is also famous for not only its position in Japanese history and the beauty of the temples and gardens of the area, it's also famous for deer. The deer is a revered animal in the history of Nara, and the parks below the deer are allowed to simply walk about, and it's become a boom for tourism because people love to see the deer and feed the deer. The reason, I guess, that this evolved is that the first emperor of Japan is rumored to have entered this area in Japan riding on the back of a deer, and it's depicted in some famous historical paintings. So the deer has this position in Nara. You don't see this in other cities. and it's everybody loves it. You just have to be careful where you step. Well, time for a few highlights. A few highlights of Jaune Brilliant, which is a color that I've used in the past. It's made by Holbein, opaque and warm. So it's going to create a sort of glint on some of the small points on the temple. I'll use it here and there. Just again to kind of make the feeling of the sunlight a little stronger. Just as an accent. It's a You can mix it, of course, with any of the watercolors, but it tends to make the transparent colors, feel a little chalky. So I reserve this color for times when I paint over an edge that I would like to have. I can regain that edge with this color. Or if at the end of the painting, if I want to bring a little more reference to the light, as I do now, I'll add this color and kind of finalize the painting this way. And you can also mix it with colors, as I said, and I'm probably going to mix a little bit of that with red and try to splatter a little bit in that area where I have that center area near the rooftops where I have a couple of red trees rising. I want to show a few more reds, little points of red, and rather than just dot with the tip of my brush, I prefer to splatter. So I'm using a smaller brush here, adding a little bit of that Jaune Brilliant, and just flicking my wrist in the area of that I want them to go. Experience is helpful here because it is easy to have them go someplace where you wouldn't want one, like up into the sky. It would be not so good if a big blob of red went up there. I guess you could put balloons in the sky and resolve it, but you could also cover up that top part with a blank sheet of paper and have more control over where the splatter falls. This splatter I enjoy because it gives another random quality or even natural quality to an area that is harder for us to paint with brushwork. So I use splatter in that case, just to give a few leaves rising up in that area. And these will they will darken a bit as they dry. They won't remain quite this bright. So again, it's another sort of subtle expression that I feel contributes to the painting. At this point, I'm thinking to just place a light wash over the whites in the upper right, the distant city. I want the white that's there now is just a little bright to my eye, so it's a subtle adjustment. Mostly water, a little bit of the yellow ochre, and I'm just knocking the whites back into the painting. So they'll still register as interesting shapes back there. But here's the finished piece, and you can see how things have dried.